You create detailed plans and strategies, but somehow they fall apart when you try to execute them in the real world. Every time you think you've figured out the perfect approach, unexpected obstacles emerge, and your carefully crafted strategy crumbles, leaving you frustrated and wondering why others seem to succeed where you consistently fail. I am Sun Tzu, the ancient strategist whose principles have guided victorious leaders for over 2,500 years, and I mastered the art of strategy in the deadliest arena of all, the battlefield. What I discovered about why strategies fail will transform how you approach planning and execution, giving you the timeless principles that ensure victory before the battle even begins. The same strategic wisdom that prevented countless defeats on ancient battlefields can prevent your plans from failing in today's challenges. But first, like this video, subscribe for more ancient wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready for strategic mastery. I still remember the first time I held the lives of thousands in my hands. The ancient scroll of strategy lay before me, its bamboo surface weathered by countless campaigns, containing the fundamental principles that separate victory from defeat. As a young commander in the armies of Wu, I thought strategy was about clever tactics and brilliant maneuvers. I was wrong. The weight of command is something no amount of training can prepare you for. When I first received orders to lead a campaign against the armies of Karch, I spent weeks crafting what I believed was the perfect battle plan. Every detail was accounted for, every contingency planned. I was confident, perhaps even arrogant, in my preparation. But strategy, I learned, is not about creating the perfect planets, about understanding why plans fail and how to adapt when they do. My first major engagement taught me this lesson brutally. Despite my meticulous planning, the enemy moved in ways I hadn't anticipated. Weather conditions shifted. Supply lines were disrupted. Within hours, my beautiful strategy was in ruins. That night, as I walked among my wounded soldiers, I realized that good intentions don't guarantee good outcomes. The burden of responsibility when lives depend on your strategic decisions changes everything. You cannot afford to be attached to your plans when reality demands adaptation. This was the moment I understood that strategy is about principles, not just tactics. A tactic is what you do in a specific situation. A strategy is the underlying philosophy that guides all your tactics. When you understand the principles behind strategic thinking, you can adapt to any situation. When you only know tactics, you're helpless the moment conditions change. I learned that emotional attachment to plans leads to strategic blindness. The more effort you put into creating a plan, the harder it becomes to abandon it when circumstances require change. This emotional investment in your strategy becomes your greatest weakness. The difference between hoping for success and engineering, it became clear to me that day. Hope is passive, it relies on favorable conditions continuing. Engineering success means creating systems that work regardless of conditions, building in adaptability from the beginning, and understanding that your strategy must be alive, not static. Before me lay the shattered remains of what I had once considered my masterpiece, a battle plan so detailed, so comprehensive, that I believed it guaranteed victory. The fragments of parchment told the story of meticulous preparation, troop movements calculated to the hour, supply logistics mapped to the last grain of rice, contingencies planned for every conceivable scenario. Yet within the first hour of engagement, it had all collapsed. This experience taught me one of the most counterintuitive lessons of strategic thinking. More planning can actually lead to more failure. I had fallen into the trap that catches most strategists, the illusion of perfect planning. When you spend weeks crafting a detailed strategy, examining every variable, accounting for every possibility, you create a dangerous sense of control. You begin to believe that because you've planned for something, you can control it. But strategy operates in the realm of probability, not certainty. The more detailed your plan, the more assumptions it contains, and the more likely it is to fail when those assumptions prove false. I learned this lesson during a campaign where I planned everything down to the minute. My forces were to advance at dawn, engage the enemy at precisely the second hour, and achieve victory by midday. The plan assumed clear weather, cooperative terrain, and predictable enemy behavior. It assumed my scouts would return on time, my supply trains would arrive as scheduled, and my subordinate commanders would execute their orders flawlessly. Reality, of course, had other plans. A sudden fog delayed our advance. The terrain, swollen by unexpected rain, slowed our movement. The enemy, rather than positioning themselves where my intelligence suggested they would, had moved during the night. My beautiful, detailed plan became not just useless, but actively harmful, as my commanders struggled to adapt while still trying to follow orders that no longer made sense. This is why detailed plans often fail. They assume control over uncontrollable variables, whether enemy actions, equipment failures, human error. These factors are inherently unpredictable, yet detailed plans treat them as if they were controllable. The difference between planning and strategic thinking became clear to me that day. Planning is about creating specific sequences of actions based on assumed conditions. Strategic thinking is about developing principles and frameworks that allow you to make good decisions, regardless of conditions. Rigid adherence to plans becomes a strategic weakness because it prevents you from seeing opportunities and responding to threats. When you're focused on executing your plan, you miss the signals that should trigger adaptation. Here's the paradox I discovered. Your competitors' unpredictability is actually your advantage, if you're prepared to exploit it rather than be defeated by it. I kept a polished bronze mirror in my command tent, not for vanity, but for truth. This mirror of truth reflected not just my appearance, but forced me to confront my true capabilities and limitations before every campaign. Most commanders preferred to focus on their strengths and ignore their weaknesses. I learned that this was the fastest path to strategic disaster. My journey of brutal self-assessment began after a humiliating defeat early in my military career. I had overestimated my force's capabilities, underestimated the logistical challenges of a long campaign, and ignored the morale problems that had been building among my troops. The result was a strategic catastrophe that could have been avoided with honest self-evaluation. The strategic disasters that come from overestimating your capabilities are both predictable and devastating. When you believe you're stronger than you are, you take on challenges you cannot handle. When you assume you're faster than you are, you commit to timelines you cannot meet. When you overestimate your resources, you make promises you cannot keep. But here's what most people don't understand. Knowing your weaknesses is more valuable than knowing your strengths. Your strengths are obvious, they're what got you to where you are. Your weaknesses are hidden, and they're what will destroy you if you don't acknowledge them. I developed a practice of honest resource evaluation that served me throughout my career. Before every campaign, I would spend days cataloging not just what I had, but what I lacked. How many experienced officers did I really have? How reliable were my supply lines? What was the true morale of my troops? How much did I really know about the terrain we'd be fighting on? This wasn't pessimism, it was realism. And realism is the foundation of all effective strategy. Self-deception in strategy leads to inevitable defeat because strategy operates in the real world, not in our fantasies about the real world. You might convince yourself that you have certain capabilities, but the battlefield, whether literal or metaphorical, will test those capabilities ruthlessly. The relationship between self-knowledge and strategic positioning became clear to me over years of campaign experience. When you know exactly what you can and cannot do, You can position yourself to maximize your strengths and minimize your weaknesses. You can choose battles you can win and avoid battles you cannot. But when you operate on false assumptions about your own capabilities, you constantly find yourself in positions where you're overmatched, overextended, or overwhelmed. Most people skip this step of honest self-assessment because it's uncomfortable. It requires acknowledging limitations, admitting weaknesses, and accepting that you might not be as capable as you'd like to believe. But this discomfort is nothing compared to the pain of strategic failure that comes from self-deception. The mirror of truth never lies, but it only reflects what you're willing to see. The spy's report lay before me, dozens of parchment scrolls filled with meticulously gathered intelligence about enemy movements, supply lines, leadership structures, and troop morale. This collection represented months of dangerous work by my intelligence network, and it held more strategic value than 1,000 soldiers. Information, I learned, is the ultimate strategic weapon, not because it guarantees victory, but because it prevents the strategic surprises that guarantee defeat. How I developed my intelligence network became legendary among military strategists, but the principles apply far beyond warfare. I understood that in any competitive situation, the side with better information has an insurmountable advantage. While my opponents relied on assumptions and guesswork, I built systematic methods for understanding their capabilities, limitations, and most importantly, their patterns of decision-making. The difference between assumptions and intelligence in strategic planning cannot be overstated. Assumptions are what you hope is true about your competition. Intelligence is what you know is true. Most strategies fail because they're built on assumptions that prove false when tested. Against reality, my methods for understanding opponents went far beyond their obvious capabilities. Anyone could count enemy soldiers or estimate their supplies. The real strategic advantage came from understanding their motivations, their fears, their decision-making patterns, and the personality of their leadership. I spent as much time studying enemy commanders as I did studying enemy armies. How did they react under pressure? What were their preferred tactics? Where had they succeeded and failed in the past? What were their personal ambitions, and how might those influence their strategic choices? This psychological intelligence often proved more valuable than tactical intelligence. When you understand why someone makes decisions, you can predict what decisions they'll make. When you can predict their decisions, you can position yourself to exploit them. Most strategies fail due to poor enemy assessment because strategists focus on what they want their opponents to do rather than what their opponents are likely to do. They build plans around the assumption that their competition will act rationally, predictably, or in their own best interests. Assumptions that are often false. The strategic advantage of knowing your opponent better than they know themselves became my signature approach. While enemy commanders operated on instinct and habit, I operated on analyzed patterns and understood motivations. This allowed me to anticipate their moves and position my forces to counter them before they were even made. I developed specific methods for identifying patterns in competitive decision-making. How did enemy commanders respond to pressure? What were their preferred timing for major moves? How did they allocate resources under different conditions? These patterns, once identified, became predictive tools for strategic planning. The cost of strategic surprises taught me to invest heavily in intelligence gathering. A single piece of missing information could destroy months of preparation. A misunderstood enemy capability could lead to catastrophic positioning. An undetected enemy movement could turn certain victory into devastating defeat. Strategic surprises are almost always the result of poor intelligence, not superior enemy capabilities. The siege engine stood ready but unused, its powerful mechanisms gleaming in the morning sun. This unopened weapon had achieved victory through its mere presence, demonstrating the highest form of strategic thinking power without destruction. The enemy had surrendered not because we used the engine, but because they understood we could. This became my philosophy of supreme excellence, achieving your objectives through positioning, not confrontation. To subdue the enemy without fighting this is the acme of skill. I won several strategic campaigns without a single battle being fought, not through weakness or luck, but through such superior positioning that resistance became futile for my opponents. When your strategic position is strong enough, your enemies defeat themselves by recognizing the impossibility of victory against you. Why is direct confrontation often the weakest strategic choice? Because when you fight, even if you win, you suffer losses. You expend resources, time, and energy. You create enemies who might have been allies. You reveal your capabilities to future opponents. Most importantly, you operate in the realm of chance, where superior positioning can still lead to unexpected defeat. The art of making your position so strong that opposition becomes futile requires understanding what your opponents truly want and need. Often, direct confrontation exists only because both sides believe they cannot achieve their objectives any other way. Strategic thinking finds ways to achieve your objectives while allowing your opponents to achieve theirs, or shows them that opposing you prevents them from achieving their own goals. I learned to create win-win scenarios that eliminated the need for conflict. Instead of destroying enemies, I found ways to make them allies. Instead of defeating competitors, I found ways to make competition irrelevant. Instead of fighting for resources, I found ways to create more resources. This approach requires a fundamental shift in strategic thinking. Most people see strategy as a zero-sum game, where your victory requires your opponent's defeat. But the highest level of strategic thinking creates positive-sum outcomes where everyone can win and you win the most. The relationship between strategic positioning and effortless victory became the cornerstone of my approach. When you understand the terrain, literal or metaphorical, better than your opponents, you can position yourself in places that are inherently advantageous. When you control key resources, information, or relationships, you can achieve your objectives without direct confrontation. I developed methods for identifying positions of natural advantage. These might be physical locations that provided tactical benefits, but more often they were strategic relationships, exclusive access to resources, or superior information that created unassailable competitive advantages. Fighting, I came to understand, is evidence of strategic failure, not strategic success. If you must fight to achieve your objectives, it means you failed to position yourself properly in advance. Superior strategy eliminates the need for fighting by making your victory inevitable and obvious to all parties involved. The supreme excellence is achieved when your opponents submit without resistance, not from fear, but from recognition that opposition is pointless. I spread the merchant's map before me, its detailed charts showing trade routes, market territories, and competitive landscapes that would have been unimaginable in my time. Yet, as I studied this modern terrain, I recognized the same fundamental principles that governed ancient battlefields. The terrain shapes everything in strategy. In my military campaigns, I learned that the same army could be invincible on favorable ground and helpless on unfavorable ground. The wise general chooses his battles based on terrain advantage. The foolish general ignores terrain and wonders why superior forces fail. Adapting ancient battlefield principles to contemporary competitive environments requires understanding that terrain has evolved but not disappeared. In business, your terrain might be market conditions, regulatory environments, or technological landscapes. In career advancement, your terrain might be organizational culture, industry trends, or professional networks. In personal goals, your terrain might be family, circumstances, financial resources, or available time. The different types of competitive terrain in modern environments follow predictable patterns. There is favorable terrain where you have natural advantages. Perhaps you have unique skills, exclusive relationships, or superior resources. There is unfavorable terrain where you're at a disadvantage, perhaps facing competitors with more resources, better positioning, or home field advantage. There is disputed terrain where multiple competitors vie for the same objectives: market share, promotions, or opportunities. There is difficult terrain where progress is slow and expensive for everyone involved. And there is desperate terrain where failure means destruction and only total commitment can lead to success. Reading the strategic landscape of your specific situation requires systematic analysis, not casual observation. What are the key success factors in your competitive environment? Who controls the critical resources? What are the unwritten rules that govern how competition actually works? Where are the choke points that determine who wins and who loses? Understanding your competitive environment determines your strategic options more than your own capabilities. A superior force on poor terrain will lose to an inferior force on good terrain. A brilliant strategy inappropriate to the terrain will fail, while a simple strategy that leverages terrain advantages will succeed. The relationship between terrain and tactical choices became clear to me through countless campaigns. Certain terrains favor speed and mobility. Others favor patience and positioning. Some terrains reward direct assault, while others punish it. The successful strategist adapts their approach to maximize terrain advantages rather than fighting against terrain disadvantages. I learned to use environmental factors to strategic advantage by understanding their deeper implications: seasonal patterns, economic cycles, political changes, technological shifts. These environmental factors create opportunities for those prepared to exploit them and disasters for those who ignore them. The mistake of using the same strategy in different competitive terrains destroys more strategic efforts than enemy action. Each terrain requires its own approach, its own tactics, its own timeline. What works in one environment may be catastrophic. In another, the strategist must be like water, adapting to the shape of the container while maintaining forward momentum toward the objective. The sundial of opportunity cast its shadow across the campaign table, its ancient timepiece teaching me the most crucial lesson of strategic thinking, that timing determines victory more than strength, speed, or even strategy itself. I learned that the precise moment of action could transform certain defeat into overwhelming victory. My understanding of timing as the most crucial strategic element came through painful experience. I watched superior forces fail because they moved too early, and inferior forces triumph because they moved at exactly the right moment. Timing, I realized, is the invisible weapon that amplifies all other strategic advantages. The campaigns I won simply by acting at the right moment taught me that opportunity has a narrow window. Wait too long, and the moment passes. Act too early, and you lack the conditions necessary for success. The art lies in recognizing when all factors align to create maximum advantage. I remember a campaign where my forces were outnumbered 3-1. Traditional military thinking suggested we should avoid engagement entirely. But I recognized that our enemy's apparent strength was actually temporary. Their supply lines were overextended. Their troops were tired from rapid marching, and their commanders were overconfident. The window for action was small, perhaps only hours, but within that window, our inferior numbers could achieve decisive victory. Why is premature action as dangerous as delayed action? Because premature action wastes resources on conditions that aren't yet favorable. You expend energy fighting against circumstances instead of with them. Delayed action allows favorable conditions to pass, often permanently. The opportunity that exists today may never return. The art of recognizing when conditions are optimal for strategic moves requires understanding the difference between hoping conditions will improve and knowing they have improved. Hope looks for reasons to act. Knowledge waits for the right reasons to act. I developed methods for identifying optimal timing through systematic observation of patterns. Enemy fatigue follows predictable cycles. Market conditions shift according to recognizable signals. Organizational attention moves in waves. Personal energy and motivation fluctuate on schedules. The strategic thinker learns to read these patterns and time their actions accordingly. Creating timing advantages through strategic patience became one of my most powerful tools. While enemies rushed into action based on emotion or pressure, I waited for conditions to align in my favor. This patience often allowed me to achieve objectives with a fraction of the effort required by hasty action. The relationship between preparation and the ability to seize moments is absolute. Timing opportunities appear suddenly and disappear quickly. Only those who have prepared in advance can capitalize on them. Preparation without timing is wasted effort. Timing without preparation is missed opportunity. Most strategies fail due to poor timing, not poor planning. The right action at the wrong time produces wrong results. The wrong action at the right time sometimes succeeds despite itself. But the right action at the right time creates results that seem miraculous to observers who don't understand timing's role. The quartermaster's ledger lay open before me, its detailed records of resource allocation telling the true story of campaign success and failure. These carefully maintained accounts had determined the outcome of entire wars, proving that victory belonged not always to the strongest, but to those who used their resources most efficiently. My philosophy of resource management in strategic campaigns was born from watching powerful armies destroy themselves through waste and inefficiency. Unlimited resources create lazy strategy. Limited resources force strategic creativity. The constraint of limited resources often produces superior strategic thinking because it demands maximum impact from every decision. Most strategies fail due to poor resource allocation rather than poor strategic thinking. Brilliant plans become worthless when they require resources you don't have, when they waste resources on low-impact activities, or when they fail to reserve resources for unexpected challenges. The principle of strategic efficiency, maximum impact with minimum resources, became the foundation of my approach. This doesn't mean being cheap or cutting corners. It means understanding which resources will have the greatest strategic impact and concentrating your investment in those areas. I learned to calculate the true cost of strategic actions by considering not just immediate resource requirements, but opportunity costs, hidden costs, and long-term implications. Every resource committed to one objective is a resource unavailable for other objectives. Every action taken closes off other possible actions. Strategic thinking must account for these trade-offs. The relationship between resource constraints and strategic creativity fascinated me throughout my career. When you have unlimited resources, you can solve problems by throwing more resources at them. When resources are limited, you must solve problems through better strategy. Some of my most elegant strategic victories came from situations where resource constraints forced innovative solutions. Why abundance can be as dangerous as scarcity in strategic thinking became clear through observing wealthy but defeated armies. Abundance breeds complacency, encourages waste, and reduces the pressure that drives strategic innovation. When you can afford to make mistakes, you don't develop the discipline to avoid them. I developed methods for making resources work harder than opponents' resources. This involved concentrating resources at decisive points rather than spreading them evenly, timing resource deployment for maximum impact, and finding ways to multiply resource effectiveness through strategic positioning. Resource multiplication often proved more valuable than resource accumulation. A small force in the right position at the right time could defeat a large force poorly positioned. Limited supplies used efficiently could outlast abundant supplies used wastefully. Strategic thinking multiplies whatever resources you have. The art of strategic economics extends beyond material resources to include time, attention, energy, and relationships. These intangible resources often determine strategic success more than money or equipment. The strategist who manages all resources efficiently gains insurmountable advantages over those who focus only on the obvious ones. The cavalry banner snapped in the wind above my fastest units, its fabric worn from countless lightning-fast strikes that had decided battles before enemies could react. This symbol represented one of my most powerful strategic weapons, the ability to move faster than opponents could adapt. My campaigns that succeeded through speed rather than strength taught me that velocity can overcome almost any disadvantage. When you move faster than your opponent can react, you operate inside their decision-making cycle. They're always responding to your last move while you're already executing your next 3 moves. The strategic advantage of moving faster than your opponent can react goes beyond simple speed of execution. It's about speed of recognition, speed of decision-making, and speed of adaptation. While your competitors are still analyzing the situation, you've already analyzed, decided, and acted. I learned that speed in decision-making is more valuable than perfection in planning. Through countless situations where quick, good decisions defeated slow, perfect decisions, the enemy doesn't wait for you to complete your analysis. Opportunities don't pause while you gather more information. Markets don't stop moving while you perfect your strategy. This doesn't mean making hasty or reckless decisions. It means developing the capability to make good decisions quickly based on incomplete information. It means building systems that allow rapid recognition of patterns and swift implementation of responses. The relationship between momentum and strategic success became one of my central insights. Momentum in strategy works like momentum in physics. It takes energy to create, but once established, it carries you forward with less effort. Strategic momentum makes everything easier, attracting resources, inspiring followers, demoralizing opponents, and creating opportunities. Maintaining strategic momentum while adapting to changing conditions requires understanding the difference between strategic direction and tactical flexibility. Momentum comes from consistent movement toward your objective. Tactics may change as conditions change, but the momentum toward your goal must be maintained. I developed methods for identifying when momentum was building, when it was threatened, and when it was lost. Momentum has observable signals: increasing speed of progress, growing support from allies, decreasing resistance from opponents, and accelerating achievement of intermediate objectives. The danger of losing initiative through hesitation or overanalysis destroyed more strategic efforts than enemy action in my experience. Initiative is like a fire. It requires constant feeding or it dies. Every moment spent hesitating is a moment your opponent can use to seize initiative from you. When you have initiative, you force opponents to react to your moves rather than execute their own strategy. They become followers in a game where you set the rules, the pace, and the objectives. Losing initiative means becoming reactive instead of proactive. Why slow strategies fail, even when they're theoretically superior, became clear through watching methodical commanders lose to aggressive ones. Speed creates opportunities, denies opponents time to prepare optimal responses, and exploits the psychological pressure of constant action. The commander's seal bore my personal mark, a symbol of unified authority that prevented the chaos of divided leadership. This simple piece of carved stone wielded more power than any weapon because it represented the principle that effective strategy requires singular, decisive leadership. My experience with the chaos that comes from divided strategic authority taught me that even brilliant strategies fail when no one has clear authority to make final decisions. I witnessed armies with superior numbers, better equipment, and sound strategies lose battles because their leadership structure was confused, contradictory, or paralyzed by committee decision-making. Strategies fail when too many people are involved in decision-making because strategy requires speed, consistency, and accountability. When decisions must pass through multiple approval layers, they slow down to the point where opportunities are missed. When multiple people can modify strategic decisions, the strategy loses coherence and becomes a collection of compromises that satisfy no one and achieve nothing. The principle of unified command in strategic execution doesn't mean one person must make every decision. It means one person must have final authority and accountability for strategic outcomes. This person coordinates input from advisors, considers multiple perspectives, and then makes decisive choices that everyone else implements without debate. I learned how to maintain strategic coherence when working with teams by establishing clear decision-making protocols before strategy execution began. Everyone understood their role, their authority, and their accountability. They knew when to provide input, when to execute orders, and when to exercise independent judgment within defined parameters. The relationship between clear authority and strategic success is direct and measurable. Clear authority enables fast decision-making, consistent execution, and rapid adaptation when circumstances change. Unclear authority creates delays, contradictions, and paralysis at exactly the moments when decisive action is most needed. Collaborative planning often leads to compromised strategy because it seeks consensus rather than effectiveness. Committees can gather information and generate options, but they cannot make the hard choices that strategy requires. Every strategic decision involves trade-offs that someone will disagree with. Seeking everyone's approval means avoiding the decisive choices that create strategic advantages. I developed methods for making decisive strategic decisions without consensus by distinguishing between decisions that required input and decisions that required compliance. Input decisions gathered perspective from advisors before I made the final choice. Compliance decisions were communicated clearly with the expectation of immediate implementation. The art of decisive leadership in strategy requires accepting the responsibility that comes with authority. When you make strategic decisions, you own the consequences. This responsibility cannot be shared or diluted without undermining the authority necessary for effective implementation. Strategic authority works only when it's backed by competence, clarity, and accountability. Authority without competence leads to poor decisions. Authority without clarity leads to confusion. Authority without accountability leads to recklessness. The false banner flew proudly over our decoy position, its bright colors drawing enemy attention exactly where I wanted it, while my real forces moved unseen toward their true objective. This piece of cloth, representing forces that didn't exist in that location, achieved more strategic impact than battalions of soldiers could have accomplished through direct assault. My use of deception as a strategic tool came not from moral flexibility, but from understanding that warned by extension. All serious competition is fundamentally about information advantage. The side that controls what their opponent knows, believes, and expects will defeat the side that reveals everything honestly. The difference between lying and strategic misdirection is crucial to understand. Lying involves making false statements about facts. Strategic misdirection involves controlling which true information your opponent receives and when they receive it. It's about timing, emphasis, and selective disclosure rather than fabrication. I learned how to control my opponent's perception of my capabilities and intentions through careful management of information flow. If I wanted enemies to believe I was weak, I would ensure they observed evidence of weakness while concealing evidence of strength. If I wanted them to expect attack from the east, I would allow them to discover preparations that suggested eastern assault while concealing western positioning. This isn't about dishonesty, it's about understanding that in competitive situations, your opponents will make assumptions based on incomplete information. Strategic thinking means ensuring those assumptions work to your advantage rather than theirs. Why transparency in strategy often leads to strategic failure became clear through observing commanders who revealed their intentions, capabilities, and plans to enemies. When your opponent knows exactly what you're going to do, they can prepare perfect countermeasures. When they don't know, they must prepare for multiple possibilities, spreading their resources and attention. Strategic deception works because human psychology seeks patterns and explanations. When people observe limited information, their minds automatically fill in the gaps with assumptions. The strategic thinker learns to provide information that encourages useful assumptions while avoiding information that reveals true intentions. The ethics of strategic deception in competitive environments follow different rules than personal relationships. In personal relationships, trust requires honesty. In competitive relationships, success requires controlling information flow. This isn't moral relativism, it's recognition that different contexts have different rules. I developed methods for using misdirection to create strategic advantages without compromising personal integrity. The key was understanding that concealing information isn't the same as providing false information. Allowing opponents to make incorrect assumptions isn't the same as lying to them. The relationship between unpredictability and strategic success reinforced my commitment to deception principles. Predictable opponents are easy to defeat because you can position yourself to counter their expected moves. Unpredictable opponents force you to prepare for multiple scenarios, diluting your strategic focus. Strategic misdirection multiplies the effectiveness of limited resources by forcing opponents to respond to threats that don't exist, while leaving them unprepared for threats that do exist. The flexible sword in my hands could bend without breaking, its metal forged with techniques that created strength through adaptability rather than rigidity. This weapon taught me that strategic thinking must mirror its design-maintaining core, strength while adapting to changing conditions. My philosophy of strategy as a living, adaptable system emerged from watching rigid, strategic thinking destroy superior forces. The commanders who treated their strategies like sacred texts, unchangeable and perfect, consistently lost to those who treated strategy as a living tool that evolved with circumstances. The campaigns I won by abandoning my original strategy taught me the most valuable lesson about strategic flexibility. I remember a particular engagement where my initial plan called for a direct assault at dawn, but overnight reconnaissance revealed that enemy positioning had shifted dramatically. A rigid commander would have proceeded with the original plan, justifying it as staying the course or not confusing the troops. I abandoned the plan entirely and adopted a completely different approach that achieved the same objective through different means. Why rigid strategic thinking leads to strategic failure is simple. Reality changes faster than plans. Markets shift, competitors adapt, technologies evolve, circumstances transform. A strategy that doesn't evolve becomes increasingly disconnected from the conditions it was designed to address. The art of maintaining strategic direction while adapting tactics requires understanding the difference between principles and methods. Your strategic principles, your fundamental objectives and values should remain constant. Your tactical methods, how you achieve those objectives, should adapt constantly to changing conditions. I learned to recognize when my strategy needed to change by monitoring the gap between expected results and actual results. When this gap widened beyond acceptable limits, it signaled that conditions had changed enough to require strategic adaptation. Waiting for perfect information about changed conditions meant waiting too long. The relationship between strategic principles and tactical flexibility became the cornerstone of my approach. Principles provide direction and consistency. Flexibility provides responsiveness and effectiveness. One without the other leads to either aimless wandering or rigid failure. Strategic principles answer the question, what are we trying to achieve, and why? Tactical flexibility answers the question, how should we achieve it given current conditions? The first remains stable. The second changes constantly. I developed methods for maintaining strategic coherence while adapting tactics by establishing clear decision-making criteria. When should tactics change? When conditions change significantly enough to make current tactics ineffective. When should strategy change? When objectives become impossible or circumstances make completely different objectives more important. Why the best strategists are comfortable with strategic uncertainty became clear through experience. Uncertainty isn't a problem to be solved. It's a condition to be managed. Strategies that require certainty to succeed will fail because certainty doesn't exist in competitive environments. The best strategic thinkers embrace uncertainty as a source of opportunity rather than fear it as a source of problems. When conditions are uncertain for everyone, advantage goes to those who can adapt fastest and most effectively to changing circumstances. The mind reader's scroll lay unfurled before me, its ancient text, revealing psychological insights that allowed me to predict and influence opponent behavior with startling accuracy. This knowledge proved more valuable than any weapon because it enabled me to defeat enemies using their own minds against them. My study of human psychology in strategic contexts began with a simple observation. People make decisions based on emotions first, then justify those decisions with logic. Understanding this fundamental truth about human nature opened possibilities for strategic influence that pure tactical thinking could never achieve. How to predict opponent behavior through psychological analysis became one of my most powerful strategic tools. I learned to identify personality patterns in enemy commanders. Were they naturally aggressive or cautious? Did they prefer complex plans or simple ones? How did they respond to pressure, uncertainty, or unexpected setbacks? These psychological profiles allowed me to anticipate decisions before they were made. An aggressive commander under pressure would likely attack prematurely. A cautious commander facing uncertainty would likely delay action too long. A proud commander confronted with humiliation would likely make emotional rather than rational choices. The role of emotions in strategic decision-making, both yours and your opponent's, cannot be understated. Fear makes people defensive, and reactive anger makes them reckless and predictable. Pride makes them stubborn and inflexible. Greed makes them overextend and vulnerable. Understanding these emotional drivers enabled strategic manipulation of opponent behavior, but emotional understanding applied to yourself as well. I learned to recognize my own emotional patterns and how they influenced my strategic thinking. When did I become overconfident? What situations triggered defensive reactions? How did pressure affect my decision-making quality? Prevented emotional decisions that could undermine strategic objectives. It also enabled emotional discipline that kept me thinking clearly when opponents succumbed to emotional reactions. Understanding motivation proved more important than understanding capability, because capability tells you what someone can do, but motivation tells you what they will do. A capable opponent without strong motivation poses less threat than a less capable opponent with desperate motivation. I developed methods for analyzing opponent motivations by examining their past decisions, their stated objectives, their resource allocation patterns, and their responses to different types of pressure. What drove their decision-making? What were they trying to protect? What were they willing to sacrifice to achieve? How to use psychological pressure as a strategic weapon required understanding each opponent's psychological vulnerabilities. Some commanders cracked under time pressure. Others made poor decisions when facing multiple simultaneous challenges. Still others became paralyzed when their assumptions about the situation proved false. The relationship between strategic stress and poor decision-making became a tool for creating advantages by increasing uncertainty, complexity, or time pressure for opponents while maintaining clarity and calmness for myself. I could force them into making the kinds of mistakes that strategic victory requires. Most strategists ignore psychology and lose to inferior opponents because they focus only on logical, rational factors while ignoring the emotional and psychological factors that actually drive human behavior. The Treaty Stone stood as a monument to the power of strategic partnerships. Its carved surface documenting alliances that had multiplied our strength far beyond what we could achieve alone. This ancient marker reminded me that the greatest victories often came not from defeating enemies, but from transforming them into allies. My approach to building strategic alliances and partnerships was born from recognizing a fundamental truth. Going it alone is often a strategic mistake. Regardless of your individual capabilities, even the strongest force can be overwhelmed by multiple weaker forces working together. Even the most capable individual can be outmaneuvered by coordinated opposition. Strategic alliances multiply your effective strength, extend your reach into territories you couldn't access alone, and provide capabilities you don't possess individually. But more importantly, they deny these same advantages to your opponents by removing potential allies from their reach. The art of creating mutually beneficial strategic relationships requires understanding that sustainable alliances must serve all parties' interests, not just your own. One-sided relationships eventually collapse when the disadvantaged party finds better alternatives or simply refuses to continue the arrangement. I learned to identify potential strategic partners by analyzing their objectives, capabilities, and constraints. The best allies were those whose objectives complemented mine without directly competing, whose capabilities filled gaps in my own strategic toolkit, and whose constraints created dependencies that I could help address. Strategic alliance formation followed predictable patterns. First, identify mutual interest areas where cooperation serves both parties better than competition. Second, define complementary capabilities ways each party can contribute unique value to the partnership. Third, establish clear agreements about resource sharing, decision-making authority, and benefit distribution. How to identify potential strategic partners requires looking beyond obvious candidates to find unexpected sources of mutual benefit. Sometimes your best allies come from completely different fields who share similar challenges. Sometimes former opponents become valuable partners when circumstances change their strategic position. The relationship between strategic alliances and force multiplication became central to my thinking. A well-chosen ally doesn't just add their strength to yours. They multiply your effective capabilities by providing access to their networks, their knowledge, their resources, and their unique positioning. I developed criteria for evaluating potential alliances based on strategic fit rather than personal preference. Did this potential ally share compatible objectives? Could they contribute capabilities we lacked? Would alliance with them deny strategic advantages to our opponents? Could we trust them to honor agreements when under pressure? Most alliance strategies fail due to poor partner selection, choosing allies based on immediate convenience rather than long-term strategic value, or based on personal relationships rather than strategic compatibility. Strategic cooperation requires balancing independence with interdependence. Maintain enough independence to survive if alliances fail, but create enough interdependence to make the alliance valuable to all parties. The balance between independence and strategic cooperation became an ongoing challenge, requiring constant adjustment as circumstances changed and alliances evolved. The tactical withdrawal map spread before me showed not defeat, but repositioning for future victory. This detailed plan demonstrated that strategic retreat, properly executed, could be more valuable than stubborn advance. The lines and arrows on this map represented one of the most misunderstood aspects of strategic thinking. My philosophy of strategic retreat as a tool, not a failure, developed through watching commanders destroy their forces by refusing to withdraw when conditions demanded it. Pride, stubbornness, and misguided courage led to unnecessary casualties and strategic disasters that could have been avoided through timely retreat. The campaigns I won by retreating at the right moment taught me that withdrawal can be the strongest possible move in certain circumstances. I remember withdrawing from a position that seemed advantageous because intelligence revealed that enemy reinforcements would arrive within days. By retreating, I preserved my forces, avoided encirclement, and drew the enemy into pursuing me into terrain that favored my smaller, more mobile army. 3 months later, I achieved decisive victory in a battle that would have been impossible if I had stubbornly held the original position. Knowing when to withdraw is as important as knowing when to advance, because strategic thinking operates in extended time horizons, not just immediate tactical situations. Sometimes short-term retreat enables long-term advance. Sometimes tactical withdrawal creates strategic advantage. The difference between strategic retreat and strategic defeat lies in intention and outcome. Strategic retreat is voluntary withdrawal designed to improve your position for future action. Strategic defeat is forced withdrawal that weakens your position and reduces your options. Strategic retreat preserves resources, maintains flexibility, and often confuses opponents who expect you to fight for every position, regardless of strategic value. When you retreat voluntarily, you control the timing, the route, and the destination. When you're forced to retreat, your opponents control these factors. I learned to use retreat to improve strategic position by understanding that not all ground is worth holding. Some positions become liabilities when circumstances change. Some objectives become less valuable than the resources required to achieve them. Some battles aren't worth fighting, regardless of your ability to win them. The relationship between short-term losses and long-term strategic gains requires thinking beyond immediate results to ultimate objectives. Will holding this position contribute to final victory? Will winning this battle help or hurt the larger campaign? Will achieving this objective strengthen or weaken overall strategic position? Strategic retreat often creates opportunities that stubborn advance cannot. When you withdraw, opponents must decide whether to pursue potentially overextending themselves or consolidate their gains, potentially missing opportunities to eliminate you entirely. Pride in strategy often leads to strategic disasters because emotional attachment to positions, plans, or past successes prevents rational assessment of current conditions. The strategist who cannot retreat when conditions demand it will eventually face situations where retreat becomes impossible and destruction becomes inevitable. Strategic withdrawal requires as much skill as strategic advance, perhaps more, because it must be executed while under pressure and often while opponents are attacking. The crown of conquest rested heavily on my brow, its weight reminding me that victory was only the beginning of strategic success. This symbol of triumph carried a warning that most strategists ignored. Winning creates new challenges that require different skills than those that achieved the victory. My understanding that victory is just the beginning of strategic success came through observing commanders who achieved brilliant tactical victories only to lose everything in the aftermath. They had mastered the art of achieving objectives, but failed to master the art of maintaining them. Victory creates its own problems. Success attracts new opponents who want to take what you've gained. Achievement raises expectations for continued performance. Winning positions must be defended, managed, and leveraged effectively, or they become liabilities rather than assets. Most strategic victories are lost in the consolidation phase because the skills required to win are different from the skills required to maintain victory. Winning requires aggression, risk-taking, and decisive action. Maintaining victory requires patience, diplomacy, and systematic management. The art of maintaining strategic advantages after achieving objectives requires shifting from offensive to defensive. Strategic thinking. How do you protect what you've gained? How do you build on initial success? How do you prevent opponents from adapting to your new position? I learned to plan for victory consolidation before achieving victory itself. What would success look like? What new challenges would it create? What resources would be required to maintain the position? How would opponents likely respond to our success? Building sustainable strategic positions from temporary victories requires understanding the difference between winning and succeeding. Winning is achieving your immediate objective. Succeeding is creating lasting value from that achievement. Temporary victories become lasting success through systematic consolidation, securing gains against counterattack. Building systems to maintain advantages, developing capabilities to leverage success into further advances, and creating conditions that make reversal difficult or impossible. The relationship between strategic success and strategic responsibility became clear through campaigns where victory brought obligations that were more challenging than the original conflict. Success creates stakeholders who depend on your continued effectiveness. Achievement creates expectations for further achievement. Victory creates enemies who will work to reverse your gains. Strategic responsibility requires accepting that success makes you a target. Other strategists will study your methods, seek your weaknesses, and attempt to replicate or counter your advantages. The higher you rise, the more people are motivated to bring you down. Why winning strategies often fail to become lasting strategies is because they're designed for achievement, not maintenance. The aggressive tactics that create breakthrough success can become liabilities when applied to consolidation. The risk-taking that enables victory can threaten the security needed to maintain gains. The principle of strategic moderation in victory teaches that overwhelming success can create dangerous instability. When you win too completely, you may eliminate necessary balance in competitive systems, creating conditions that eventually work against you. Sustainable victory requires knowing when to stop advancing and start consolidating. The master's final scroll lay before me, its weathered surface containing the culmination of strategic wisdom earned through decades of campaigns, victories, defeats, and hard-won insights. This document represented not just tactical knowledge, but the distilled essence of strategic thinking that would guide future generations long after my battles were forgotten. My reflection on a lifetime of strategic thinking and application brings me to this fundamental truth. Strategy is not about winning individual battles. It's about understanding the principles that enable consistent success across all forms of competition. The specific tactics change with circumstances, but the underlying principles remain constant across centuries, cultures, and contexts. The timeless principles that will guide strategic success in any era are these: know yourself with brutal honesty, understand your opponents better than they understand themselves, position yourself where victory becomes inevitable rather than possible, move faster than your competition can adapt, use resources efficiently rather than abundantly, maintain unity of command and clarity of decision-making, adapt constantly while maintaining strategic direction, think psychologically as well as logically, build alliances that multiply your capabilities, retreat strategically when advance becomes counterproductive, consolidate victories to create lasting advantage. These principles worked on ancient battlefields, and they work in modern boardrooms, political campaigns, personal careers, and life challenges. The applications change, but the principles endure because they're based on fundamental truths about human nature, competitive dynamics, and strategic thinking. Strategic mastery is a journey, not a destination, because each level of understanding reveals new complexities and possibilities. The strategist who believes they have learned everything has stopped learning, and a strategist who stops learning will eventually face opponents who haven't. I encourage you to continue developing strategic thinking throughout your life by applying these principles consistently, studying the strategic efforts of others, and learning from both your successes and failures. Every situation offers strategic lessons if you're prepared to see them. The relationship between strategic success and personal growth became clear to me over years of campaign experience. Strategic thinking changes how you see problems, opportunities, and relationships. It develops patience, discipline, and perspective that serve you far beyond competitive situations. My final advice for those who would master the art of strategy is this: begin with small applications of these principles in low-risk situations. Master the fundamentals before attempting complex strategies. Learn to think strategically about everyday challenges before applying strategic thinking to major life decisions. The responsibility that comes with strategic knowledge and power cannot be ignored. When you understand how to influence outcomes, you bear responsibility for how you use that influence. Strategic thinking should serve worthy objectives and consider the welfare of others, not just personal advantage. The legacy of strategic mastery lies not in the victories you achieve, but in the wisdom you pass forward to those who will face their own strategic challenges in times and places you cannot imagine.